June 1944. Northern Mariana Islands, Pacific Ocean. The morning air is thick with smoke. The smell of oil and salt burns in the throat. Along the runway of Saipan, an enormous shadow rests among the wreckage. A downed aircraft so large it seems out of place amid the twisted metal of Zeros and Betty bombers. American soldiers gather around it, cautious, whispering. They've never seen anything like it. Its fuselage gleams with a faint metallic shimmer under the rising sun. Rivets the size of bullets line its body. Engines, 4 of them, hang motionless, their propellers mangled, wings scorched black. A medic wipes soot from the fuselage and finds a kanji character stenciled in fading red. Renzan, mountain range. To the Japanese, it was meant to be a symbol of strength, the super bomber that would carry fire across the Pacific. But to the Americans who now stand before it, it looks like a tomb with wings. One of them laughs nervously. "Super bomber, huh? Looks more like a flying furnace." The laughter fades. A mechanic climbs the wing, opens a hatch, and shines his flashlight inside. The beam cuts through the darkness, revealing a maze of wires, fuel lines, and metal veins slick with gasoline. He freezes. The others lean closer. Something about it is wrong, terribly wrong. Inside, they find no insulation, fuel tanks pressed directly against the crew seats, exposed wires running beside leaking lines. No self-sealing systems, no safety barriers. It's a death trap, a weapon built with the precision of desperation. And as they stand there, surrounded by the ghost of Japan's greatest hope, one of the officers murmurs quietly, "If this is their super weapon, then they've already lost the war." What they didn't know that morning was that this wreck wasn't just a bomber. It was a message, a glimpse into the empire's collapse, and the terrifying truth of how far a nation would go when it had nothing left to lose. It began not in the sky, but in the ashes of Tokyo's factories. By 1942, Japan's empire was stretched thin. Its engineers overworked, its resources nearly gone. The Americans had unleashed the B-29 Superfortress, a machine that could rain fire from the stratosphere, far beyond the reach of Japanese fighters. For Japan, that was more than a tactical disadvantage. It was humiliation written across the sky. The Imperial Navy needed an answer. They demanded a bomber that could rival America's flying fortress, one that could reach Hawaii, maybe even the continental United States itself. They called it Renzan, the mountain range. It was to be Japan's first true 4-engine heavy bomber, a machine of endurance and elegance, capable of carrying 2 tons of bombs over 4,000 kilometers. On paper, it was magnificent. On the assembly line, it was a nightmare. Japan didn't have the alloys, the tools, or the fuel to sustain such ambition. Factories worked under candlelight, machines powered by scavenged generators. Engineers built with what they had, steel meant for ships, aluminum recycled from downed planes, copper wiring stripped from civilian power grids. Every nut and bolt carried the scent of exhaustion. Nakajima engineers toiled in silence, drafting blueprints on rice paper, hands trembling from lack of sleep. Prototypes emerged like ghosts, shimmering with promise, but doomed from birth. Engines overheated, hydraulics failed, entire wings tore apart during testing. A young mechanic remembered the day the first prototype caught fire. We watched it burn for hours, and when it finally stopped, we just stood there, because we had no metal left to build another.
Still, the order came from above: continue at all costs. The bomber wasn't just a machine now, it was propaganda, proof that Japan could still dream of striking back. So they worked and built and prayed. They replaced precision with faith, and faith with desperation. Every decision was a compromise: lighter armor, thinner fuel lines, faster assembly. Safety was a luxury. Survival was not the goal. Victory was. One engineer confessed years later, "We knew it was dangerous, but we built it anyway, because the emperor asked for a miracle, and we tried to give him one." The result was a paradox, a masterpiece of ingenuity built under impossible conditions, a bomber that could fly but never truly survive. It was as if Japan had created a monster it couldn't control, a machine born not from strength, but from the slow decay of an empire's will. And as the first Renzan prototype rolled onto the runway, one witness whispered a line that would echo long after the war. No one realized that this apparent triumph carried within it the seed of our defeat.
Late 1943. The skies above the Pacific were not kind to dreams. When the first prototype of the Nakajima G4M Renzan, Japan's so-called super bomber, finally took flight, the empire held its breath. It was massive, elegant, almost beautiful. 4 engines roaring against a bruised sky, a symbol of defiance. But beauty means nothing to physics. Minutes after takeoff, the engines began to tremble. Fuel pressure dropped. Vibrations rattled through the fuselage like a death rattle. From the ground, engineers could see a faint orange glow forming under the wings, heat blooming from engines that burned hotter than their own metals could endure. The test pilot's voice cracked through the radio. "Temperature climbing, oil pressure unstable, she's shaking apart." He tried to level out, but the Renzan refused to obey. Its massive frame groaned as if in pain, the wings flexing beyond tolerance. Moments later, the left engine burst into flames. The bomber banked sharply, then fell. It struck the ground beyond the runway in a sheet of fire. The impact shook the hangars. When the smoke cleared, all that remained were twisted fragments of ambition and silence. No one spoke. The officers simply turned away. Days later, a report arrived from Tokyo. It didn't mention the fire. It didn't mention the deaths. It simply read, "Continue production. The nation's spirit depends on it." So they did. The second prototype was rebuilt from the ashes of the first. Every failure was patched, every weakness ignored. Engines were rebuilt using salvaged parts from destroyed planes. Fuel tanks were redesigned, but without proper insulation, they still leaked gasoline. Wiring was replaced with thinner cables to save weight, and the hydraulic systems were simplified to speed production. What emerged was not an improvement. It was a compromise, disguised as progress. When the second bomber took off, it managed to stay aloft longer, but by the end of the flight, its landing gear jammed, and the fuel tanks, once again, began to sweat gasoline into the cabin. One mechanic watching from the runway whispered, "It's not a bomber, it's a funeral waiting to happen." Even Japan's top engineers began to lose faith. They knew the truth. The empire was running on fumes. Factories were under bombardment. Fuel refineries destroyed, and every hour spent on the Renzan was an hour stolen from fighters and interceptors that could actually protect the homeland. But orders were orders. The imperial command needed symbols, something to parade, something to believe in. So the engineers stayed silent.
They painted over the scorch marks. They replaced burnt components with recycled steel. And they rolled the super bomber back onto the runway. A machine that looked powerful from a distance, but inside was nothing more than a coffin made of promises. One pilot's logbook, later recovered, ended with a single line. "We fly because we must, but every takeoff feels like betrayal." The super bomber had finally flown, but in its roar there was no pride, only the sound of a nation beginning to break.
June 1944, Oslito Airfield, Saipan. The war had shifted. For the first time, American boots stood on Japanese soil. The air was thick with the smell of burnt aviation fuel and victory. And then, amid the wreckage of crumpled Zeros and shattered hangars, a strange silhouette caught the eyes of U.S. engineers. It was unlike anything they'd seen before, massive, angular, alien. A Japanese bomber, but not like the others. The men circled it slowly, flashlights sweeping over scorched paint and warped aluminum. Someone muttered, "This thing's huge. Are we sure it's even Japanese?" They found a marking, faded kanji on the tail, Renzan. They had no idea what it meant, but they knew this wasn't a standard aircraft. When the engineers from Wright Field arrived days later, the bomber was still there, stripped of ammunition, silent, its wings half buried in coral dust. They began the dissection. Panels were removed, bolts unscrewed. The interior revealed itself inch by inch, and what they found left them stunned. Fuel lines ran beneath the crew's seats. No armor separated the tanks from the engines. Wiring, exposed, tangled, and melted from heat, ran dangerously close to fuel conduits. Control systems were overcomplicated, redundant to the point of chaos. One mechanic shook his head in disbelief. "It's a miracle this thing even flew once." They kept digging. Behind the cockpit bulkhead, they found what appeared to be hastily riveted repairs, metal patched over holes not from battle, but from structural stress. The Japanese had been forcing their dream to hold together with literal scrap. But then they discovered something even stranger. Tucked inside the bomber's fuselage were handwritten notes, flight logs, sketches, half-burned test reports. Translated weeks later, they revealed a haunting truth. "We lack the metals, we lack the oil, but the Emperor requires a miracle. We will make it fly even if it kills us." The American engineers stared at one another in silence. The Renzan wasn't a machine of dominance. It was a desperate gamble built by men who knew the war was already lost. One American officer, a veteran of the B-29 program, summed it up in a single line. They built a masterpiece of suicide. Every detail told the same story, from the thin fuel tanks to the shrapnel-filled cockpit glass, from unsealed rivets to crude replacement parts that didn't even match their blueprints. And yet there was something heartbreaking about it, because beneath the flaws, they could see genius, the kind that burns out when the world gives it nothing but ashes to work with. The Americans documented everything: measurements, photographs, internal structures. The captured Renzan would later be shipped across the Pacific to Wright Field for analysis, where engineers confirmed what the wreck had already whispered. Japan's technological brilliance was real, but it was suffocating inside a dying system. What they had discovered was not a threat. It was a warning. That day, one American engineer wrote in his notebook, "This is not an airplane. It's a monument to a nation trying to outfly its own extinction." The laughter that had once filled the hangar was gone. because everyone understood what they were really looking at. Not a superweapon, not a miracle, but a machine built by ghosts, men who had already accepted that they were building their own end. And in that silence, a new kind of realization dawned. The war was no longer about technology, bravery, or willpower. It was about endurance. And only one side still had the fuel to endure. That was the invisible turning point. It didn't happen in the skies or on the battlefield. It happened there, inside the broken ribs of a bomber that was never meant to live.
By 1945, the war had become an equation, and Japan was running out of numbers. Their factories were smoking ruins, their fuel reserves gone. Their super bomber, the Renzon, existed only in fragments, its blueprints smudged with ash and oil. But across the Pacific, the United States had done the impossible. It had turned war into an industry. While Japan struggled to build one bomber, America built 1,000. While Japanese engineers forged parts by hand, American machines stamped them by the millions. The empire of the rising sun was being crushed not by soldiers, but by systems. In March 1945, the skies over Tokyo turned red. 200 B-29 superfortresses, each one carrying 10 tons of bombs, swept across the city in formation so vast that Japanese civilians mistook it for an eclipse. They dropped 500,000 incendiaries. Entire districts vanished in hours. The temperature on the ground reached 2,000 degrees. Wooden homes became vapor. Oxygen disappeared from the air. And the sound. The sound was not a roar, it was a tide, a living storm of fire and steel. One survivor wrote later, "The sky itself burned. We did not run, we simply stopped being." The Japanese Air Command tried to respond. A few interceptors managed to take off. Old Zeros clawed into the flames, their wings shaking, engines screaming, chasing shadows they could never reach. They tried to climb to the altitude of the B-29s, but the fuel froze in their lines before they got there. And so, desperation found its final form. The same engineers who had built the Renzon were ordered to redesign it, not as a bomber, but as a weapon of sacrifice. They removed the guns, reinforced the nose with steel, filled the fuselage with explosives and fuel, and sent men to fly them. One way. A new report reached Washington. The enemy has begun using their heavy bombers as guided missiles. For the Americans, it was horrifying, but also proof. Proof that the enemy had finally broken. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, American production was accelerating beyond comprehension. Trains loaded with tanks and fuel crossed the Midwest every hour. Cargo ships departed San Francisco in endless convoys. And in the skies above the Pacific, there was never silence anymore, only the unbroken hum of engines. It became a psychological weapon. Japanese pilots called it the noise, a deep vibration that never stopped, the sound of inevitability. Everywhere they went, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the same pattern repeated. Bombers darkened the horizon. Ships appeared like cities on the sea. And when the ground trembled, the Japanese knew another piece of their empire was about to die. An intercepted communication from a Japanese general read, "The Americans fight like machines. Their factories are their army. They do not run out. They do not rest. They only move forward." The few surviving Renzon bombers, those super bombers once hailed as symbols of hope, were stripped for parts. Their engines reused for training planes.
Their aluminum melted down to make shells for anti-aircraft guns that could no longer reach the bombers above. The machine that was meant to strike fear into America was now reduced to scrap metal, feeding the very war it could never win. And still, the bombers came. Every night, every dawn. Their sound was the new music of war, mechanical, endless, perfect. One Japanese pilot described it in his final letter. "The sky is filled with engines. We shoot, we miss, we fall. It is as if the gods themselves have built machines to erase us." By the summer of 1945, the balance was gone. Japan was no longer fighting an enemy. It was fighting the idea of mass. The Renzon had failed to become Japan's superweapon, but in its shadow, America had revealed its own, the weapon of endless production. It was a new kind of terror, not born from a single machine, but from millions working as one. And as the empire crumbled beneath the sound of 1,000 engines, one thing became certain. The war's end would come from exhaustion, from inevitability, from the thunder of progress that no one could stop.
Wars are not only fought with bullets and bombs. They are fought with philosophies, ideas forged in steel, oil, and conviction. Japan believed in perfection. Every plane, every ship, every weapon, handcrafted, precise, almost sacred. Theirs was a doctrine of beauty and discipline. An engineer once wrote, "To build is to serve is to perfect. But perfection takes time, and time is the one thing war does not give." Across the Pacific, America followed a different creed. It wasn't perfection they sought. It was momentum. Factories replaced workshops, assembly lines replaced artisans, and mistakes were no longer shameful. They were data. Every failure fed the next success. Every broken prototype became a blueprint for progress. It wasn't elegance. It was evolution. Inside Detroit's factories, the rhythm of war sounded like a heartbeat. Presses thundering, welders sparking, cranes swinging molten metal across endless hangars. Men and women, millions of them, worked in shifts so continuous that lights never turned off. Each day, the United States built more planes than Japan could build in a month. Each week, they produced more fuel than Japan would refine for an entire year. It was not luck. It was design. The weapon wasn't the bomber or the tank. It was the system that built them both. One officer from the U.S. Army Service Forces summarized it simply. "Our true genius is not invention, it's replacement." Where Japan tried to preserve perfection, America embraced impermanence. A bomber could be lost, another would replace it. A tank could burn, 5 more would roll off the line before dawn. Machines were temporary, but the machine that made the machines, that was eternal. Meanwhile, inside Japan's shrinking empire, factories still ran, but on silence and prayer. Engineers scavenged from wrecks, melting down the remains of fallen Zeros to keep the dream alive a little longer. They called it recycling victory, but it was more like resurrecting ghosts. Fuel grew so scarce that aircraft were tested on fumes. Engines were started once a week to save gasoline. And the same pilots who had once sworn to protect the emperor were now being trained to die for him. Their planes turned into one-way coffins of metal and faith. The contrast was absolute. One nation worshipped craftsmanship, the other worshipped capability. And that difference, invisible, mechanical, philosophical, decided the fate of millions. American generals began to see war not as combat, but as a form of engineering. Logistics became a weapon. Infrastructure became armor.
Every gallon of fuel, every rivet, every bolt was part of a vast organism, self-replicating, self-correcting, unstoppable. It wasn't the B-29 that won disguise. It was the idea that built it, that progress is born from chaos, not control. And in that contrast lay the downfall of the empire. Japan had believed power came from precision, from control, hierarchy, and ritual. America discovered power came from freedom, the freedom to fail, to adapt, to move without fear of imperfection. Years later, one historian wrote, "The Americans industrialized uncertainty. They turned trial and error into an art form, and out of that chaos came victory." The Renzan, Japan's so-called super bomber, became the perfect symbol of this divide. It represented a nation trying to will itself into greatness through mastery and sacrifice, while its enemy simply built, broke, and built again, until nothing could stop it. In that realization lies the true doctrine of power, that strength is not the absence of weakness, but the ability to grow stronger because of it. The Japanese engineers sought transcendence through perfection. The Americans achieved supremacy through iteration. And when the smoke cleared, the truth became undeniable. The war had not been won by a plane, or a bomb, or even an army. It had been won by an idea.
August 1945, Tokyo Bay. The sea is calm. The sound of engines, once constant, once deafening, has fallen silent. What remains is smoke and ghosts and the whisper of defeat. Across the Pacific, the last surviving Renzan superbomber sits in an American hangar. Its wings stripped, its cockpit gutted, its engines cold. Technicians walk around it quietly, like archaeologists at the ruins of a lost civilization. The plane is no longer feared. It is studied, measured, understood. The same machine that once promised to turn the tide of war now serves only as a relic, a reminder of what desperation builds when hope dies. When American engineers opened its panels for the last time, they found what they already knew to be true. Leaking tanks, hand-welded seams, wire insulation made from scavenged cloth. Even the rivets were uneven, driven by exhausted hands that trembled from hunger. One of them ran his fingers along the frame and whispered, "This wasn't built to win a war. It was built so they wouldn't have to admit they'd lost one." For months, the Renzan sat there, a silent witness to the end of an empire. It was too damaged to fly, too rare to repair, too symbolic to destroy. So it simply waited. And when it was finally dismantled, piece by piece, no one cheered, no one mourned, because everyone who touched it understood. This wasn't the death of a bomber. It was the autopsy of an idea. Japan had tried to conquer the world with willpower, but willpower cannot refine fuel. Willpower cannot replace lost steel, and willpower cannot outbuild a system that never stops moving. The Americans didn't just defeat Japan. They outlasted it. They outproduced it. They turned progress itself into a weapon. And no empire could fight an enemy that learned faster than it could hate. Years later, one of the U.S. analysts who examined the captured bomber wrote in his diary, "It looked terrifying on the outside, like a monster out of myth. But inside, it was empty, hollow, fragile. It wasn't power we found in there. It was fear." He was right. Inside the Renzan lay the truth of the Pacific War.
that brilliance without structure and courage without fuel are nothing but sparks in a storm. They laughed when they first heard of Japan's superbomber. They laughed at its name, its promise, its arrogance. But when they opened it, when they looked inside, they stopped laughing, because what they found wasn't a weapon, it was a grave for engineers who believed they could defy reality, a grave for a nation that mistook devotion for destiny, and a grave for an empire that tried to fight the future and lost. The engines that once roared now rest in silence. The factories that built them are dust. The men who flew them are gone. But the lesson remains, carved in metal and memory. Power is not what you build, it's what you can build again. They captured Japan's superbomber, and what they found inside was the end of an era.